Last session, we explored the drift, the quiet separation that opens between what an organization says it does on paper and what it actually does under pressure. We ended with a question posed by Chapter 3 as the new test of governance. Not which standard owns this control, but what are we trying to create, what must we protect, and what do we need to deliver to stay credible? That question turns out to be powerful enough to organize an entire way of thinking about the digital enterprise. This session introduces the mental model built around it, one simple enough to hold in one hand, but concrete enough to anchor real decisions. It starts with a problem most senior leaders recognize immediately, even if they've never named it quite this way. The goal of this session is a mental model for governing the digital enterprise by evidence rather than confidence. 3 words carry the whole thing: create, protect, deliver. These aren't 3 departments, 3 phases, or 3 items on a checklist. They're 3 things every digital organization has to do simultaneously, at every important boundary all the time. The challenge, and the opportunity, is that most organizations have never been set up to think about all 3 at once. They've been set up to think about each one separately, in separate rooms with separate vocabularies and separate reward systems. And the consequences of that separation show up in ways that are surprisingly predictable. Here's the pattern. In most senior leadership environments, 3 distinct conversations happen at the same time, and almost never connect. The first frames technology as growth. The vocabulary is products, roadmaps, market timing, competitive advantage. People in this conversation get rewarded for creating value and shipping features. Their blind spot is what they can't see from there. Brittle supplier integrations, operational drag. The technical debt accumulating quietly behind every fast launch. The second frames technology as risk. The vocabulary shifts to cyber threats, outages, fraud, regulatory exposure, and mitigation. People here get judged on preventing loss and managing assessments. Their blind spot is the controls that pass every test in a controlled environment, but fail the moment real-world load conditions differ from what the test assumed. The third frames technology as operations. The vocabulary narrows to uptime, throughput, backlog, service levels. These teams get measured on keeping things running. Their blind spot is that they absorb the consequences of decisions made in the other 2 rooms, decisions they had little input into and can't easily change. Each group optimizes for its own measures. The system's overall behavior stays invisible to everyone until it fails. Here's what that invisible behavior looks like when it finally surfaces. Green dashboards coexist with broken customer flows because the dashboard measures what the growth conversation cares about, while the broken flow lives in the operational reality nobody was tracking. Meticulous framework alignment coexists with brittle supplier integrations, because the risk conversation produced perfectly documented controls that nobody verified against how the supplier actually behaves under load. Confident board presentations coexist with anxious post-incident reviews, because the board sees the story the paper system tells, while the operations team lives with the story of the living system. 3 orbits, each internally coherent, each reinforcing its own view of reality. They don't collide until something fails. And by then, the collision is expensive in money, in trust, and often in the time it takes to figure out which conversation was supposed to own the problem. The solution isn't to add another conversation. It's to give all 3 a common lens, one simple enough that every leader in every room can hold it at once. Here it is, the digital enterprise as a single system that must simultaneously do 3 things at any important digital boundary: create new value, change behavior, launch capabilities, adjust processes, and respond to market signals without stopping everything else. Protect that value, manage cyber risk, fraud, safety, and regulatory exposure in a way that is proportionate and grounded in evidence. Deliver the value promised reliably at the cadence customers expect, with recoverable failure rather than catastrophic breakdown. 3 circles connected. The simplicity is intentional. Most leadership teams already carry too many models, 3 lines of defense diagrams, plan, build, run cycles, framework wheels, maturity matrices. This model exists to provide something those frameworks don't: a single sentence that captures what the digital enterprise is supposed to do and why it keeps struggling to do it consistently. The test isn't whether each of these exists somewhere on an org chart. The test is whether they can support each other at the same boundary simultaneously. That's the distinction that changes everything. Take the first dimension. Creation sounds simple. Develop capabilities, ship features, upgrade systems. In practice, it faces two opposing forces at once. On one side, market pressure, competitors moving, revenue targets looming, the constant legitimate push to ship faster. On the other side, legacy drag, change management processes designed for quarterly releases now being applied to daily deployments, architecture constraints accumulated over years, risk requirements that arrive late as gateways to clear rather than design inputs to incorporate. The question isn't how to let people move as fast as they want, or how to stop them from breaking things. The question at any specific boundary is more precise. What outcomes are genuinely non-negotiable here? And what does intentional change look like within those boundaries? When an organization defines that clearly, say, customers completing a specific transaction within an acceptable time and error threshold, something shifts. Risk and speed stop being opposites pulling in different directions. They become two dimensions of the same design problem. The creation team, the risk team, and the operations team all have a shared target. That shared target is what turns three separate conversations into one coherent one. The second dimension is where assurance most commonly goes wrong. Traditional protection means policies, standards, controls, and audits. Each has genuine value. None of them answers the question that matters most under real conditions. Do these protective measures actually work when they're needed? If protection is defined solely as controls, it can be marked complete on paper and still leave critical boundaries exposed. Policies can exist without being understood by the people expected to follow them. Controls can pass every testing cycle and then fail under real-world load conditions that look slightly different from what the test environment assumed. A system can align with every relevant standard and still have unprotected boundaries, simply because nobody verified how the controls behaved when conditions deviated from the design. That's the illusion of protection. A completed checklist, a fraying rope underneath. The reality of assurance looks different. It generates evidence that protective measures still work after changes are made, and under the conditions that actually arise. It asks two diagnostic questions. When something goes wrong, what prevents it from becoming catastrophic? And what evidence allows the organization to credibly say, not just claim, that its clients are protected? Those questions become sharper when you see what happens when they go unasked. One of the clearest documented examples of what happens when the three dimensions fall out of balance involves the Boeing 737 MAX program. The goal was clear and commercially legitimate: deliver a fuel-efficient aircraft quickly, without requiring costly pilot retraining. The pressure was real, the engineering teams were competent, and the timeline was aggressive. The blind spot was in the protection dimension. A flight control system was designed to automatically correct specific handling characteristics. Its existence, behavior, and failure modes were not fully disclosed to pilots or airlines. Assumptions about how quickly pilots would respond to certain alerts were embedded in the safety analysis, but those assumptions didn't reflect how pilots actually behave in real operating conditions. Two fatal crashes followed. Formal investigations confirmed what the evidence showed. Protection mechanisms had not kept pace with the creation and delivery decisions that were driving the program forward. Safety assurance had relied on documentation rather than evidence of how the system performed under real conditions with real operators. This was not a failure of engineering competence. It was a failure of balance. Create and deliver dominated protect. The system performed as designed, until reality introduced variables that the protection layer had never actually been tested against. For any leader overseeing digital systems, the parallel is direct. The same failure mode appears when cyber controls are documented but not verified under real-world conditions, when supplier integrations pass paper review but aren't tested under actual load. Protection that isn't tested isn't protection, it's documentation. The third dimension is where most operational teams spend their working lives, and where the most valuable information in the system gets generated and too often discarded. The old way treats delivery as pure execution. The people running production absorb the consequences of design decisions made in other rooms, with limited ability to influence those decisions before they land. Incidents get managed. Workarounds get invented. The learning stays local. The new way treats delivery differently. Delivery is where the outcomes leadership committed to get tested against reality. Every incident, near miss, exception granted under pressure, and workaround adopted in the field carries information about the gap between how the system was designed and how it actually behaves. Think of delivery as generating a continuous upward flow of telemetry, signals that feed back into both creation and protection. Organizations that treat delivery as pure execution discard that information. Organizations that treat delivery as evidence generation use it to improve creation and protection before the next failure. This reframes what operations teams actually do. They're not just keeping the lights on. They're running the most honest experiment in the organization, the only one conducted under real conditions with real users on a bad day. That data is too valuable to stay in the incident log. And the place where all three of these dimensions collide most visibly is at the boundary itself. Picture three streams converging on a single point, a boundary. Creation wants to change behavior and launch new capabilities. Protection wants to manage exposure and secure outcomes. Delivery wants to maintain cadence and ensure recoverable failure. On the other side of that boundary, value. The transaction that clears. The data that stays accurate. The service that holds under load. Here's the critical insight. The test of a digital system happens at the boundary. That's where all three forces meet. Not in the boardroom, not in the risk committee, and not in the deployment pipeline. At the point where the system actually touches reality. If the three dimensions don't share a common lens at the boundary, they will actively undermine each other. Creation ships a change that operations can't safely absorb. Protection imposes a control that hinders the integration creation needs. Operations patches around both sets of constraints and hopes nothing breaks on a Friday evening. Shared lens, shared boundary, shared outcome. That's the design problem. And to make it concrete, it helps to look at a specific boundary where all three collide every single day. Throughout this series, a recurring example will ground the concepts in something specific. It's a mid-sized financial services firm called Meridian. And the boundary we'll return to again and again is Meridian's settlement process. The mechanism through which the firm confirms, reconciles, and finalizes financial transactions between its clients and their counterparties. Settlement is one of those processes that's invisible when it works and catastrophic when it doesn't. When transactions clear on time and accurately, nobody notices. When they don't, when a settlement fails or a reconciliation exception cascades, the consequences are immediate, highly visible, and expensive. It's also a boundary where creation, protection, and delivery don't take turns. They operate simultaneously under tension every day. Product managers want to add new settlement options. Risk teams want to prevent regulatory events. Operations teams need to process volumes within defined windows without cascading failures. That daily collision makes it an ideal illustration. Every concept in this series, every capability, every accountability structure, every assurance mechanism will be shown working at this boundary. By the end, you'll have a complete picture of what governing by evidence looks like in one place under real pressure. Here's what those three pressures look like at Meridian's settlement boundary specifically. On the creation side, product managers, architects, and engineers want to add new settlement options, adjust cutoff times, integrate additional counterparty networks. Their goal is expanding capacity without disrupting existing flows. Speed matters. Clients who can't get new settlement capabilities will find a firm that offers them. On the protection side, risk, compliance, and security leaders focus on settlement integrity, data accuracy, fraud exposure, and regulatory requirements. Their goal is preventing any settlement failure from becoming a regulatory event or a client loss. Their concern isn't speed. It's the cost of getting it wrong. On the delivery side, operations teams manage the boundary every day. They handle processing volumes, monitor latency, resolve exceptions, and manage relationships with counterparty systems that don't always behave as documented. Their goal is reliability. Can the boundary process expected volume within the required window, recover from a failure without cascading, and escalate clearly when human judgment is required? When these three groups operate independently, each optimizes for its own goal, and they patch around each other. When they share a lens grounded in the same outcomes at the same boundary, the three dimensions become aspects of a single design problem. That's the difference the model makes. And that model doesn't exist in isolation. It sits within a larger architecture connecting what, how, and who. Here's how the pieces fit together, not as three separate things, but as three layers of one coherent structure. The top layer answers the question, what? Create, protect, deliver. It describes the outcomes the organization's value streams must achieve at specific boundaries. It's the direction-setting layer. What are we actually trying to accomplish here? The middle layer answers, how? 7 capabilities that describe how digital value streams are governed, operated, and improved. Govern, assure, plan, design, change, execute, innovate. Without the top layer, these capabilities float free of purpose. Govern what exactly? Execute toward which outcome? The top layer gives them direction. The bottom layer answers, who? The 4 capabilities introduced in Chapter 2: governance, resilience, assurance, and accountability. This layer assigns ownership to specific people for specific outcomes, backed by evidence. It's what makes the whole structure credible rather than aspirational. Together, these 3 layers give a board or executive team a coherent answer to the question that most governance conversations fail to answer clearly. Who is responsible for ensuring the system works, on what terms, and with what evidence to back it up? That complete answer changes what a board conversation sounds like. Here's the before and after. What boards typically hear now? We are 87% compliant with the NIST framework. All high-risk audit findings have remediation plans. Uptime for the quarter was 99.9%. These aren't false statements. They're just not connected to anything the board can act on. They describe coverage. They don't describe capability. And they certainly don't tell anyone whether the organization could survive a surprise at its most critical boundaries. What a board should hear instead. Here are our 3 most critical boundaries where we create, protect, and deliver value. Here is how our capabilities operate at those boundaries, and the operational evidence proving they are holding. And here is who owns each specific outcome, and exactly what they will change if the evidence shifts. Notice the difference. The first set of statements is about status. The second is about capability, evidence, and ownership. One satisfies an audit. The other supports a decision. That shift from status reporting to evidence-based governance is what this entire model is designed to produce. And it rests on a single discipline applied consistently across every boundary and every initiative. Here's the discipline stated simply. CPD is a perspective, not a checklist. It doesn't replace the frameworks, controls, and processes an organization already has. Provides a lens for using them. At every new initiative, the questions remain the same. At this specific boundary, what are we creating? What are we protecting? What are we committed to delivering? Answer those 3 questions with evidence rather than confidence, and something changes. The conversation moves from here's what we've documented to here's what we can demonstrate. From here's what we assessed to here's what we've observed. From here's who's responsible on the org chart to here's who owns this outcome and what they'll do when the evidence shifts. Real governance anchors capabilities to the work that matters, boundary by boundary, not to a standard, not to a maturity level, to the actual outcomes that customers, partners, and regulators depend on. That's the test. And the next session goes deeper into the operational system built to run it, the 7 capabilities that connect intent to action across the value streams that deliver the outcomes CPD describes.